Okay, this is part 3 of this chapter 10, Biodiversity and Valuation. And this is going to be about not just types of value, but measures of value. And there are direct and indirect valuation methods. Direct valuation looks at actual market prices or surveys of what people would be willing to pay. And indirect valuation looks at observable behavior to infer the monetary value of items not sold in markets. So I would think contingent valuation travel cost method would be direct, and something like perhaps hedonic pricing that we'll go into probably in this section would be an indirect. An example of an indirect valuation, the 5.2 billion spent on bottled water each year in the US and the roughly 2 billion on household water suggests that a policy that made tap water satisfactorily clean would be worth at least $7.2 billion. So you're not actually looking at um, making tap water, asking people how much they would pay to make tap water clean, but you're kind of inferring that by how much they would be spending on both tap and bottled water. Okie dokie. All right, so now looking at market prices, and this is via something called the travel cost method. Um, Looks at expenditures in the market for travel, which serves as a complement to environmental goods. In other words, people's willingness to pay for travel to experience biodiversity would be an indirect indication of the use value of of those assets. So here we have uh, a picture of demand curve, both from George's perspective and the market demand perspective. And right, looks at travel expenditures with complement environmental goods. And the willingness to pay to experience biodiversity is an indirect valuation of those assets. And our example to the right shows how much would be purchased given a diminishing marginal utility and consumer surplus. Okay, so here we have George, who values the first trip at $1,355, the second trip at $1,325, and the price is $1,300. He would take the first two, but not the third trip. Um, yeah, let me read what your author has here because I think it's a pretty good explanation of consumer surplus. Suppose trips to Madagascar cost $1,300. George values the first trip at $1,355 because it allows him to visit a new location and see lemurs in their natural habitat for the first time. The second trip is worth $1,325 to him because it's a great place, but having been there before, he finds some of the novelty has worn off. Tired of traveling and having seen it twice before, George values the third trip at $1,265. George would take the first and second trip, but not the third, because the first two are worth more to him than their cost, and the third is not. Now, in the other graph, the observed market value, this is summing all of the participants together. The observed market price approximate the value of the last unit purchased by the person who would value it at just above 1,300. And as you can see, you're beginning to have a lot more bars there, and as you continue with those bars, you begin to approximate something called a market demand curve. Okay, so now impact of elasticity on consumer surplus. Now, if you remember from macroeconomics, when a demand curve is flat, it's going to be elastic, and when it becomes steeper, it's going to be relatively inelastic. And generally, consumer surplus is greater if the demand curve is more elastic. So as you can see, we are rotating from DA to DS and finally to DC, and we can see that consumer surplus is ever increasing as a result. And what this means is that consumers get even more value than the market price if the demand curve is steeper. So if they're willing to pay more money, they're going to get a greater consumer surplus given that the market price is remaining the same. And as your book says, price is an even more cons- what you might call conservative measure of the product's value. There's other measures of value, other types of value as well. This is strictly what we might call the use value or the willingness to pay. That there's other kinds of value as well that we went over in the previous section. Okay, valuing incremental changes with the travel cost method. So we have a situation where before Eagles, the total benefit was DCN sub O, and the cost was PONOC. And so then we have the benefit of DPC. But then we introduce Eagles, and that shifts demand to the right and increases the benefit by the shaded areas, given that costs are subtracted. So that's a net incremental benefit. And this leads to a possible conclusion that I just came up with. Perhaps national parks should charge more given increases in demand. For example, we just had in our Volcanoes National Park a volcanic eruption, but Volcanoes National Park kept the same price. Maybe they would have gotten more money if they had increased the price during the eruption. It would have been a selective increase in the price of that given that event. But that's certainly something that the national parks do not do. Now, there are limitations to the travel cost method. It's appealing to actually analyze actual travel costs. Some economists argue that travel costs themselves can be subjective and unobservable. They generate estimates of use value, but not option or existence value. There's a real risk that embedded in travelers' willingness to pay to visit natural areas are the values of extraneous benefits, such as the beauty of the trip to get there. That is certainly the case. So you not only like the place, but you like the travel to the place as well. Now there's some interpretation and prices in the reality check. Let's see, what page is that in your 5th edition? Oh my, do we even have it? Ooh, maybe we don't have it. Oh, interesting. Huh. Anyway, 4th edition talks about let's see, the consumer surplus derived from Lake Mokoan in Australia using the travel cost method is about $30,000 a year. Introduction of lions into South Africa cost between $74,000 and $784,000, but increased tourism revenues was 6.2 and 14 million. So there is certainly increases in revenue above the cost. All right. Okay, this is the contingent valuation method. And here, people are asked to state their willingness to pay contingent on a hypothetical situation involving environmental assets. So it's called contingent because people are asked to state their willingness to pay. And it gets around estimating market prices because you're asked what you would do given a certain situation. And there are different question formats in your book. Let's see. Yes, they have them. Open-ended questions, dichotomous choice, placing a single value, accepted or rejected, payment cards, several values printed on them, sometimes shown to participants, bidding games, Participants receive values sequentially, either in ascending order until the value is rejected, or descending when the value is accepted. It's kind of like an auction almost. Now, pitfalls involving contingent valuation. You can have a hypothetical bias, results from participants who do not take the hypothetical situation seriously. Strategic bias, survey results of, let's see, it's apparent from the survey design that the purpose of the study is to determine whether or not to go forward with the policy. Respondents might exaggerate their willingness to pay if they favor the policy or understate it if they oppose the policy. And embedding effects are a concern where many benefits are associated with a particular action, and the expressed values might apply to more than the benefit being evaluated. Very interesting. Okay, now we have something called hedonic pricing. Here, this evaluates differences in the prices of goods and services caused by environmental assets or liabilities. For example, your book has this situation of the worker in a forest versus being on the farm. If workers are willing to accept a lower price for planting trees in a forest than on the farm, then other things equal, the difference in wages might be the valuation of being in the forest. So you're not directly measuring it, you're just looking at the difference of being in one versus being in the other. If you're willing to accept less, that's the value you place on being in the forest and or the national park. Now, there are some downside to hedonic pricing. There are often passive use values that do not enter into the prices of products. Another drawback is that large data sets are typically needed to establish statistically significant relationships between the prices and the environmental variables. So there are definitely some downsides. We have the hedonic value of Homo sapiens. And there's obviously no direct measure of Homo sapiens, but we can, let's say, EPA regulations on drinking water save lives between 0 and 6.8 million. OSHA regulations on industrial exposure save lives at 12.7 million. And so by looking at these expenditures, we can use a hedonic method to say how much human beings might be valued. Viscusi and Aldi reviewed 60 studies of the value of a statistical life and estimated, this was in 2017, and a value of a statistical life was 9.6 million. Now, this is not the life of a particular individual, but the expected value of one life made up of a small chance of losing many people's lives, such as 1 in 10,000 chance death faced by 10,000 people. Interesting. So while we don't actually place a physical value on ourselves, we feel we are priceless, the money we spend on other things can infer a value that we, in essence, place on ourselves. Okay, making use of the numbers. Armed with estimates of animal values, we can estimate policy proposals. And this section says that drinking water regulations were a bargain. In terms of the value of a life, but asbestos regulations were not. And there is an example of a policy to save 100,000 roadkill losses in a Florida state park, and they go through the calculation there, looking at the present discounted value of a barrier, and they say that setting this perpetuity value equal to 3.6 million and solving for the monetary value per animal yields a value of 1.08. And if evaluation method determined that the actual value was 1.8, 1.08 or higher, then the expense of the barrier would have been justified. Very interesting. Okay, finally, we have the issue of uncertainty. So biodiversity loss involves the complicating factors of uncertainty and irreversibility. If a species is extinct, we may never know the future value in terms of pharmaceutical drugs, etc. So we can come up with the idea of a safe minimum standard akin to a seed bank. So keeping a minimum standard of what we might consider to be valuable species. We might use some of the methods that we talked about in this chapter, and just keep them keep them in safekeeping, almost like a savings bank, in case we have um, situations where species are declared extinct and so forth. Okay, that finishes up our 10th chapter.